I've always been a fan of both history and alternate history, something I'm sure isn't anything new to all you fine people watching this video. History is fascinating, especially if you like Warhammer Fantasy since it was designed by history nerds. You also probably enjoy just looking at our past. And alternate history is a route for all kinds of stories. If nothing else, I imagine at least a couple of you have played Hearts of Iron 4. If you still play it, I hope you can get over that horrid addiction soon, but regardless, you'd probably like to see how things could have been different in some way. I'm assuming you don't just load up a historical game as one of the allies every single time you play. The genre is great though. What if X nation didn't arise? What if X event didn't happen? What if we didn't have 500 videos and if the Germans won World War II? It's a ground for both philosophical thought experiments and more relevant to a YouTube video about Warhammer, just some nice entertainment. So with all that said, the end times. They sucked. Even the most die-hard AOS fans I've talked to have no problem admitting the way GW X'd Fantasy was an abomination of storytelling, and one big spit in the face to its fanbase. But what if they didn't happen? What would the world of Warhammer Fantasy look like? For the TLDR, not good. Regardless of if the setting remained intact, the largest chaos invasion had just occurred. Millions would be dead, and the events of the end times, even without chaos, were the stuff of nightmares. So what would this world look like after it was put through the ringer? I figured, hey, maybe it'd be a fun video to try and sort that out a bit. See what the World of Legends would be like if it survived just a little bit longer, and the forces of order were able to push back the darkness one more time. But before we start, I should tell you all that end times lore really puts me to sleep. Not because it's boring, but because it's so bad I cry myself to sleep thinking about it. Luckily, I have just the thing to make myself all the more comfortable when I do, because this video was sponsored by Manta Sleep. Manta Sleep makes the finest sleeping masks to ever exist. I've used the weighted mask before, and I gotta say, it's very nice. Recently, I've been using the silk mask as well, and once again, it's an absolute joy. It's so smooth, quite literally silky smooth, and it's like I've got a pair of pillows gently resting atop my eyes. But if you think they've only got two options, then you're out of your mind. Enjoy listening to music or YouTube videos while you sleep? The Manta Sound Mask is perfect for you then. Want the best overall quality? The Manta Pro Mask is what you need. And you know what? You don't even need to sleep to enjoy a Manta mask, because the Manta Cool and Steam masks are perfect to give your eyes a nice cooling off or a day at the spa. If your eyes are strained or puffy from reading and crying about the end times, throw one of these bad boys on and your worries are over. Manta even makes other sleep aids, like traveling pillows and earplugs. Does someone in your family snore and you're stuck with them on vacation? If the answer is yes, I feel you, because that was how I ended my June. Thankfully, Manta gives you the option to shut out that dreadful noise and actually get a decent night's sleep. And all these fantastic products can be yours at a discount. Using my link in the description and pinned comment, you can get 10% off your entire order, excluding bundles. Sleep's the best time of the day, and with my link you can get a premium sleeping experience at a discount. Use Manta Sleep today, and look forward to the best night's sleep you've ever had. Now then, let's do some fake alternate history. Most of what I'll be using will be stuff I've come up with on my own, but I'll also be using some stuff from the Endhammer setting. It's a fan project built around continuing Warhammer Fantasy after GW ended it, although I'm not sure if it's even updated anymore. You can find it on 1D6chan if you're interested, which in itself is a website I'm amazed is still around. It used to be 1D4chan, which then died, but apparently it's still around in this capacity. Neat. I'll link it in the description. The biggest thing from there I'll be borrowing or stealing, depending on your point of view of me, is that the Skaven attack on the surface world just isn't nearly as successful. In the actual end times, the Skaven sort of just ate half the world when everyone had their backs turned. However you want to imagine them failing is up to you. It's the Skaven we're talking about. Out of every faction in any Warhammer setting, they're the easiest one to just go ahead and say that a win of theirs was actually a defeat instead. Maybe they did far more backstabbing, and none of the invasions ultimately succeeded for that reason, or their war machines and war beasts faltered and they just couldn't break through. As for chaos, the easiest way to handle them is to give them something far closer to realistic numbers. According to the wiki, and yes, I know using the wiki is sin, but it's the best I could find for numbers, Archaon's horde were in the hundreds of millions compared to the tens of millions of the factions of Order. Where exactly the Norskins were hiding tens of millions of people, we'll never know, but for the purpose of this video, those people don't exist. I'm not a corporate executive demanding fantasy's head on a pike, so I'm not gonna fabricate millions of chaos marauders out of thin air. Aside from that though, most of the events of the end times still occur. It's mostly just the final portions of it and the Archaon book getting retconned out of existence. Every other change I've either come up with or borrowed from somewhere else will come up along as we go. Speaking of, let's do this faction by faction. It's simpler for my brain that way. Starting with none other than the stars of the show themselves, Chaos. Chaos is one of the factions that are barely going to be changing, to be honest. The Dark Gods are undoubtedly going to be angry at the morons who failed to take down the world yet again, but I can't imagine there will be many changes to them as a faction overall. Norsca will remain a frozen hellhole populated by their worshippers. People will venture north to achieve demon princehood. Little needs to change change, and little would change. Archaon would doubtlessly be dead, as would a number of other characters just as a result of the fighting, but that just means someone else is going to be taking their place eventually. For a long time, there would probably be scattered remnants of the invasion force raiding throughout lands like the Empire, Nagaroth, and Cathay, but there's again little in the way of massive change. Another Ever-Chosen failed to conquer the Empire. Business goes on as usual. The biggest thing to note would probably be that Chaos likely won't be making any pushes southwards for hundreds of years. Millions upon millions of them died during the end times, even in canon. In this timeline, the tribes of Norska and the other miscellaneous Chaos worshippers are absolutely decimated, so the next major incursion is going to take some time to brew. The same goes for the Beastmen. There is no change that can ever be given to them short of ultimate victory. Either they're squatting in the forests being bitter about civilization, or there is no civilization and they're overrunning scattered tribes of people for all time. At best, they'd be similar to the Chaos warbands that would likely infest the Empire, causing more trouble than before, but ultimately still unable to take the larger cities that remain. Maybe they'd be ballsy enough to attack places like Null Right, but aside from that, business as usual. Speaking of, though, the Empire. This is where things start to get interesting. The Empire, in spite of surviving to fight another day, just went through the single largest chaos invasion in history. On top of that, the undead rose in numbers never before seen as a result of Nagash. The northern and westernmost provinces of the Empire are almost certainly just straight up gone in all but name. Places like Ostermark and Averland are nothing but ruin, their peoples and cities either sacrificed to the dark gods or devoured whole by legions of the dead. Even provinces that I imagined would remain, such as Reichland and Weissenland, would be devastated by both the conflict itself and the severe drain on manpower and resources. Outlying towns and hamlets would be forced to contend with the increased presence of chaotic raiders, being regularly wiped off the map by these sorts of groups. Riots over resource shortages would likely be straining things even further, with refugees in cities like Altdorf and Nuln further bringing things to a boiling point. In fact, a failed end times might be what brings about the general spread of modern government, like democracy and republics in the Empire of Man. In a world where the Empire can't keep its people fed and happy, even if the end of the world was prevented, people might revolt and demand change. Failing something as dramatic as that, in our world the Black Death was one of the major causes of the rise of the middle class. When half the peasantry is dead, the remaining ones have more room to demand better treatment, plus you need to come up with new ways to do things after half the people tending the fields died of the plague. While in this instance the disease and death comes from rampaging chaos warriors, the end result might be much the same. The Empire already does have some extent of a middle class, as evidenced by Felix Jaeger, but this could be what makes it really take off. Of course, that doesn't mean the influence of the electors or the emperor would disappear overnight. Truth be told, I don't think there would be a magical switch to being a democracy in the Empire. The seeds might be planted, but the effects would take time. A far more pressing issue was filling the gaps left by the dead electors. Plenty of them would have absolutely died during the conflicts, and someone has to fill those spots. In the worst case scenario, entire ruling bloodlines and legions might be eliminated, and until the regions can be complained, there may not be an elector count of regions like Nordland or Ostland. And this is to say nothing of the electoral question that looms above even that of filling in the missing spots. Vlad von Karstein. During the crisis, Vlad was elevated to the position of the Elector Count of Sylvania after the region was brought back as an official province into the Empire. To say this is going to cause all sorts of problems amongst the electors is an understatement. Depending on the exact state of the Empire, he may have his status revoked and an immediate war with the undead will break out. But if the Empire is too badly off for even the staunchest of witch hunter to launch a crusade, or if calmer heads like Karl Franz are able to rein everyone in, then an uneasy peace may settle over the lands of men. But in that regard, the position of the Emperor itself might be in question. Even though the region survives, there's no telling if Karl Franz would. In Endhammer, Karl Franz died as a result of housing the essence of a god. Even without that, he was fighting in the thickest of battles, such as the Siege of Altdorf. There's every chance he gets taken out, much as it pains me to say it. If he survives, then it's likely the Empire will immediately begin recovering. He's the best statesman in the old world and the best emperor in Warhammer. He can handle things. If he dies, though, who succeeds him? Is it his son? Karl was the best emperor since Sigmar, only surpassed by arguably Magnus the Pious. His son would be a natural fit for the position. Alternatively, if Boris Todbringer doesn't bull-rush his way to death via Beastmen, he'd be a good candidate too. He was initially favored to win over Karl. This might be Middenland's time in the spotlight. Imagine the worst-case scenario, though. All of the influential electors dead, perhaps even all of them if things were grim enough. The Empire's in a situation where the only elector remaining with the charisma and power to hold the throne is Vlad von Karstein, a vampire. This would immediately throw the Empire into a civil war, possibly leading to something like the Age of Three Emperors, if not outright ending it. There would absolutely be those who back Vlad, too, either as a way of simply saving their own skin or to potentially become immortal vampires vampires themselves. On the other hand, the undead are hated almost as much as chaos, and in some provinces like Aberland and Stirland, more so. There's not a chance in hell everyone would just submit to Vlad's rulership. As an aside, good luck to Gelt. Manfred might not have Manfreded him in this timeline, but after his necromancy was discovered, he's not going to be a very popular figure. Depending on the situation, he might side with an aspiring elector who's willing to support him in exchange for his arcane might, or he could go his own way in this new world. Whatever's left of the colleges of magic would execute him on the spot if he showed back up, but maybe he can go down to the border princes and form his own little magical kingdom. He can make good on his promise during his quest battle and line it with statues of people that died fighting for him. Overall, the Empire would be ravaged beyond belief. Entire provinces would be reduced to little more than ash, with those that remain choked with refugees, chaos raiders, undead, and a pervasive lack of supplies. The specifics of who lives and what's left determine whether or not the Empire will survive as it has for thousands of years, give way to a new form of government, or even break altogether. But if nothing else, the people of the nation of men at the heart of the world survived to live another day. I imagine that religious fervor would grip the Empire stronger than ever before, no matter what. Especially if Sigmar inhabits Franz's body like he did in canon, people would see signs that their god is very real, that he has the power to beat back the darkness no matter what. In true Warhammer fashion, I'm sure plenty of flagellants would roam the streets, crying how Sigmar saved us all, and he must be repaid with blood and death. But aside from those grim people, Sigmar and Ulrich might give the people hope that tomorrow is going to be better than what came before. Moving on to the next human nation, Kislev. To be blunt, Kislev is almost completely gone. Regardless of me reducing the strength of the Chaos Invasion, Kislev was still at the forefront of the largest one ever. Those who lived closest to the Chaos Wastes in Norska would likely be entirely wiped out, and even the great cities that had survived countless prior invasions like Prague would likely be entirely destroyed this time. As much as I like Kislev, and I do truly mean that, I think most of it is getting wiped off the map. But that being said, the people in it and some places within the lands likely aren't completely gone. Plenty of Kislevite refugees and soldiers fled to the Empire to continue the fight. The last few Gotchic and Felix books showed that even with their homeland gone, some Kislevites refused to do anything but go down swinging. In this scenario, they don't need to go down swinging. Additionally, I imagine at least some of the bigger cities would survive. Specifically, I would bet that Erengrad has a decent chance of making it through the storm. The Norskins don't really need it as a port to sail down from. They have the rest of Norska to raid the Empire from. As its main trading port, however, a resurgence of Kislev as a nation would almost certainly revolve around it. Supplies and goods from whatever is left of the Empire in Marienburg could come in through there, and recolonization could begin in earnest. Of course, this is still a ravaged, war-torn land that's hostile to life, even ignoring the chaos corruption. The region known as Troll Country is now just Kislev, and the chaos warbands remaining here would make the ones in the Empire look like children. But Kislev and her people are strong. They've endured the apocalypse before, and they'll endure this one if need be. Ursun's roar might not just herald the end of winter, but this time herald the fact that the world itself survived the end times. Moving on, Bretonnia. And you know, I will try here. I will try to give them some amount of credit and genuine thought. Because despite hating them more than anyone else, I apparently don't hate them as much as the collective writers of GW put together. Bretonnia, out of all the major human nations, would come away from things the best. Chaos didn't really invade them, at least to nearly the same extent as the Empire and Kislev. They did have a bit of a vampire problem, but that's more easily dealt with than that sort of thing was in the other realms. At the very least, they didn't do something like what the Empire did and name Manfred a Grail Knight. But what is going to cause them some issues is their religion. It was revealed to them during the end times that their religion was just straight up a lie. Not a lie in the sense of the Lady of the Lake was just using them for their own benefit, although that was true. The Lady of the Lake doesn't exist. She's just Lilith, the elven goddess of magic and dreams. To top it off, Lilith was reduced to having a mortal body during the end times, so she's probably not going to be granting anyone Grail Knighthood anymore. I'm sure they'll find some way to create new Grail Knights, but Lilith isn't going to be the one doing it, so the Lady of the Lake might be mysteriously absent going forward. Unlike the Empire, who's probably going to have at least some extent of religious unity, the mother of all religious unrest is about to begin in Bretonnia. All those remaining Grail Knights and Paladins are going to have to contend with the fact that everything they believed in was a ploy by an elven goddess. Faith in the Lady is going to be shattered for many of them, because even ignoring Lilia's reduction to mortality, as far as they're concerned, there is and never was a Lady of the Lake. Or Bretonnians hate their peasants because haha Grimdark make everything evil and bland like 40k, some of the Grail Knights might have a radical change of heart regarding that. If their religion is a lie, how much of their culture is? They already based their whole love of cavalry off of the Elves. Finding out their goddess was one of them might be a step too far. Some fiefdoms might become much like the Empire, or outright join it, abandoning Bretonnian ways for scientific progress, and things like not using peasants like toilet paper because poor people bad. Certainly not all of them would. The flip side of this is that plenty of them would see the benefits Lilith granted them as very real proof of her power and guidance if nothing else, and would stick to the old ways even harder than ever before. In these new post-end times days, Bretonnia is going to have to figure out what the hell it even is anymore. War would undoubtedly erupt between these two groups and everything in between these two extremes that pops up, as unlike in the Empire, they're not just arguing over new forms of governance or who should lead, but the very religion and soul of the nation itself. Of course, I still sincerely hope the horse molesters all die to a man during this, and the land is subsumed into the Empire to help its recovery, but I can only hope for so much. Giles le Breton returned during the end times, and he might become the only chance of holding Bretonnia together as its returned God King. If he can somehow make everyone who found out about the lady keep it a secret, as he did in Endhammer, then things are likely to return to somewhat normal in Bretonnia. If he doesn't or can't, however, then things will likely proceed as I described them. It'd just be a case of some places being less filled with unrest and chaos, lower sea chaos that is, because the dude who founded the nation itself is back now. Him or his court ascending new people to the rank of knighthood would be a decent way to stabilize the nation, although it does set a precedent for the lower castes of Bretonnia gaining power and social mobility that might lead to instability further down the line. It is, however, something that's likely going to happen regardless of the reason for doing it. The end times would have significantly reduced the knightly populace of the realm, so someone's gonna have to fill those slots. I'm willing to bet on two major outcomes for Bretonnia. Bretonnia will either not be able to pull itself through this turmoil and fragment into countless smaller states and fiefdoms with different ideologies, or it'll pull itself through following one ideology and would have to suffer its presence that much longer. In the second case, it might become a leader amongst the peoples of men, as it being the most stable remaining major nation bolsters its reputation and status. That sentence makes me want to vomit profusely, so in case you think I've gone soft on them, let me just reiterate my earlier sentiment. I cannot put into words enough how I hope the former scenario happens. I hope this entire land fractures and they all kill each other, and the vampire problem they have manages to subsume them all into a nation of the dead, or the Empire absorbs these smaller states so it can become the true nation of men. I hope Giles le Breton either bends the knee to the superior gods of Sigmar and Ulrich, or is crucified during the end times so we can't keep the realm together. May the land never know the rulership it once did, and may the name Bretonnia burn with the last Grail Knight. Moving on to the rest of the human realms, Cathay is in a very unfortunate position. In order for this to be an end times video and not Storm of Chaos, events of the end times still need to largely unfold as they did up till a point. And while I did say I'd nerf Chaos for the sake of the scenario, that doesn't really include the Chaos Dwarfs. And certainly, it doesn't include the Greenskins. Cathay was double-teamed by both Grimgor's Horde and the Chaos Dwarfs. I'm pretty sure the Skaven were there as well, making things generally worse for everyone involved. While newer lore in the Dragon family existing means that it probably won't be as bad, some of them are absolutely dead and the nation is still in tatters. For the sake of giving you something interesting to think on, let's say that either the Dragon Emperor or Moon Empress is dead. Certainly some of the siblings are dead, the standouts to me being Miao Ying and Zhao Ming. Zhao Ming, because magic being as wild as it was during the end times means his warpstone experiments are going to kill him, assuming the Skaven don't do it, and Miao Ying because she's taking the brunt of the Chaos Dwarfs, Chaos itself, and the Greenskins. I would imagine the nation would stay standing though, and perhaps if Yuan Bo survives it can recover in time. Unlike the Empire or Bretonnia, I don't think this is how we get the fantasy communist revolution in Cathay, or any major societal reforms like that. I can't imagine the entire dragon family would be wiped out, and as long as at least one of them survives, then surely the country would persevere as it exists now. Maybe the Monkey King would be allowed some position of power, either as a reward for him helping fight chaos or out of desperation. To round out not Asia, Nippon is still obliterated by rats and orcs, and I still can't be bothered to come up with anything for Ind and Koresh. Maybe in the post-end times world, one of those 1,000 living gods of Ind will discover some screen time. For the last human nations, I'm gonna bundle together Tylea, Estalia, Araby, and the Border Princes. Chaos's focus was almost entirely on the northern old world, Cathay, and Nagaroth. It was the Skaven who overran these nations, and in this timeline they aren't nearly as successful. If memory recalls, the writers did at least give Araby a bit of pity and say they were successful enough at fending off the Skaven to delay their attack on the Empire, so maybe they could be a rallying point for these nations to hold back the Vermintide. I imagine that the extent depends on the exact country, but these places would likely experience something of a growth period, believe it or not. Kislev is basically gone, the Empire is in shambles and has to figure out if a vampire emperor is a good idea, and Bretonnia, for all I said it probably would be better off than the Empire, still isn't going to be doing well. Depending on how badly each of these countries does, they'll all have their own exodus of people fleeing them. With the only major threat they had to face being driven off, these miscellaneous human nations could become new major players on the world stage. Tylea and Estalia would probably be the least well off, because they're right next to Skavenblight, but at the end of the day, Skaven corruption is a lot better than Chaos corruption. As much as it's a pain in the ass in Total War, for the most part it's just them wrecking whatever place they occupy. Clean up the debris and you're good to go. Warpstone's a bit trickier, but you can always sell it if you don't mind loosening your moral code just a little bit. The Border Princes in particular I imagine would experience the most growth, and some larger empires might pop out of the thousands of petty fiefdoms that inhabit the region. That region from a meta perspective is pretty much just an excuse to create your own homebrew army of humans, so maybe in this timeline your special dudes could become the next burgeoning empire of man. For a quick stop at another faction that'll take about 3 seconds to explain, the Greenskins are Greenskins. What possible change in their culture and habits could you want me to come up with? The fighting would probably make bigger orcs that would go bother the other factions, and to balance it out, a whole lot of them would be dead. Maybe in the best case scenario for them they might pursue chaos up north, having been promised the fabled Ragnarok and never gotten it. I'm not making that up, by the way. Ragnarok is what they call the end times. So stupid, but so fun. For characters, here's a fun game for you to play. Take whichever Greenskin special character you like. Grimgor, Skarsnik, Wurzag. Because there's only so many different ways I can say maybe they're fighting over here now, pick whether or not you decide each of them is alive or dead. If they're dead, then they're dead. If they're alive, imagine whatever faction they're fighting against being that much worse to live in during the post-end times world. Just lower the quality of life there by an additional 10%. For that matter, much the same for the Ogres. Ogres are pretty simple, and unlike a lot of the other races, they didn't even change that much into Age of Sigmar. They want to eat, and they'll fight for whoever pays them the most. There will, however, be noticeably more Ogres in the lands of other nations going forward. The volcano the Firebellies worship began erupting during the end times, and the Ogre homelands came down with a catastrophic case of the condition known as being covered in lava. Given that minor health hazard, there's probably going to be more and more Ogre warbands selling their services across the world. Since I forgot about them during the Chaos segment, the Chaos Dwarfs will be the first dwarfs to talk about. They get obliterated. Grimgor didn't have any mercy towards his former overlords in the end times proper, and he won't have any here. For the sake of mercy, I guess, I'll say that he didn't completely wipe them off the map, but the forges of Jar na Grund aren't going to be supplying any ambitious chaos warlords with hell cannons anytime soon. Sorry for any fans of the faction, but Grimgor walked his way through them without any difficulty when he had more chaos warriors to fight his way through. It's not going to be any prettier when you reduce how many allies the dwarfs have. For the dwarfs proper, they're in a horrid state. Thorgrim Grudgebearer declared the Age of Reckoning would come and they would retake all their lost holds. Then Carrick 8 Peaks was nuked, Karazak Harak taken by Skaven and goblins, and Thorgrim turned off his brain for a bit and gets stabbed in the back by Snikch for it. Most of the forward-thinking dwarves met a brutal end during the fighting, or at least the ones who didn't just want to sit in their mounted holds all day long waiting did. Just like Belagar, who met his end by Queek. Ironically enough, some of the major dwarf characters to survive are probably going to be the Slayers. Huge Gotchkin Felix spoiler coming up, so genuinely if you haven't read the final novel, skip ahead 20 seconds or so to be safe. After this sentence, I'm spoiling it, you have been warned. Now that anyone worried is gone, Malachi Makaisen never died in the end times. He rebuilt the spirit of Grungni and renamed it the Unstoppable, if memory serves correctly. It might be something a bit different, but still along those lines, because Malachi Makaisen is insane and doesn't see any problems with tempting fate like that. If he was on the Titanic, he would have hit the iceberg on purpose. Another potential survivor is Ungrim Ironfist. He made it till the end of the end times, and it's rather narratively fitting that the Slayer King of Carrick Kadrin is forced to postpone his duty to die in favor of his duty to rule another day. His son Garagim is probably dead, though. Don't got much to say on that. He was probably just gonna end up the next Slayer King like his dad, so it wasn't like he had a happy life ahead of him anyways. That being said, Ungrim did die in the end when his rage caused the lore of fire to consume him after he became its incarnate, so it's iffy on whether or not he'll be around. And perhaps most importantly, Gotrek and his pal Felix. Spoiler again, skip ahead a couple seconds. With the end times not being the end times, there's decent odds Grimnir might have not had Gotrek become his successor. If that happens, then maybe the duo would still be wandering about making the world a slightly better place. Hell, maybe Gotrek's place wouldn't be holding off demons in the realm of chaos, but holding back their followers in the mortal world, finally achieving the doom he seeks against the mightiest warriors of chaos. Felix can go live his life after that, assuming his wife and kid are still alive and Altdorf wasn't permanuked, or he's gonna wallow in alcohol and misery, or he's gonna take his own death oath because everyone he knows and loves is super dead. For the Dwarfs as a whole, though, things aren't great. So many holds are dead, or most of the people from them are dead, that Dwarf civilization is going to be going through a dark age. The Grey Mountain Dwarfs next to Reichland would potentially be fine, but the rest of them are going to be completely devastated. The most devastated thing, though, beyond any loss of resources or artifacts, however, would probably be the damage done to the morale as a race. Thorgrim revitalized the Dwarfs into so many different things. He convinced them to do more than wait in their holds and weather a storm they couldn't hope to outlast. He got some of them to consider using weapons that had only been developed a mere 300 years prior. He got the Dwarfs to some extent to do away with the sheer stubbornness and refusal to adapt their race is known for. Then he died, millions of Dwarfs went with him, and the Everpeak fell. They aren't going to want to be doing anything short of maybe trade with whatever's left of the Empire for centuries at best. Reclaiming Karazak is going to be top priority for whoever's left, and after that they're almost certainly going to return to sitting in their mountain holds ignoring the world around them. Any of those who are still radical-minded for the Dwarfs, which in this case means they aren't more or less massively depressed, are likely to migrate to the Empire or other human realms. Regardless of what actually happens to the realms of men, the skills of the Dwarfs in rebuilding their shattered cities would be welcomed by all. Aside from them, perhaps Slayers would be the only Dwarfs ever seen by outsiders for hundreds of years as the rest of them retreat inward. The mightiest of dooms might have passed them by, but there will still be plenty of opportunities left in the world. The Dwarfs, in short, are in for the longest period of rebuilding possible, marred with bitterness over what they've lost on a scale unlike ever before. Feeling betrayed by the ideals Thorgrim pushed, or at least seeing what he wanted is no longer possible, they're done as players on the world stage for quite some time. Better off than their chaotic cousins, but still removed from the playing field, even if they're doing it to themselves on purpose. I feel it's also worth saying that if you think I'm coming across as unreasonably hard on them, perhaps due to my inclination towards elves, I promise you I'm not trying to be. I'm trying to think of what the Dwarfs would reasonably do given their attitudes and worldviews. I imagine for many of them it won't matter that the end was prevented. They'll look around and see the greatest leaders and even their long-lived generations dead. They'll see the Everpeak in the hands of rats and orcs. They'll see their populations decimated and countless treasures lost. It won't matter to them they ultimately held off something far worse. They went through too much for their minds to take. Not in the sense of too much to take because they're weak and they're all going to go insane or anything, but too much to take for how they view the world. If it helps, amongst those who are left, there will probably be a pretty sharp rise in Slayer oaths being taken. While the proper armies of the Dwarfs won't be marching for some time except to retake lost mountains, the Slayers might be out in numbers never before seen, ridding the world of any lingering corruption axe first. All that said, I think that given enough time and assuming they aren't overrun with lingering hordes of rats and orcs, Dwarf society will recover. Which is far more than I can say for the next faction, the Elves. Elven society could generously be described as having gone completely tits up during the end times. All the elf societies, really. The High Elves easily have it the worst because Ulthuan is gone. The combined efforts and fighting of the Dark and High Elves dragged it to the bottom of the sea, and plenty of their influential leaders went with it. There will probably be scattered remnants of it left floating about, held up by lingering magic, but otherwise the homeland of the Asur is gone forever. That's not to say that the Dark Elves are in a much better position, because in Malekith's bid to take Ulthuan, he completely emptied Nagaroth. Every capable elf and all the worthwhile supplies they could hold were brought with them for the final invasion. The land itself still exists, but any of the infrastructure burned when Khornate forces plowed through it. Regardless of my disdain for the bastards, I have to admit they're almost unrivaled in the amount of property damage they can cause. And of course, the Wood Elves have to contend with the fact that while the Oak of Ages may not be rotting from the inside out anymore, their God Queen Ariel is forever gone and jammed in the body of Alariel. All of these factions would be jammed into Athel Loren, coming to terms with the fact that most of their gods are dead, the remaining ones are the dickheads, and of course the slight issue of them all still hating each other's guts is still very prevalent. The Wood Elves are the simplest faction to explain where they'll be at because they'd be much the same as they always have been, and indeed similar to the position of the Dwarfs. They want everyone else to go away now. They don't care about any of this Phoenix King nonsense or finding a new home. They still have theirs, and they would prefer if all the other elves pissed off. Their four spirit allies are likely to hold much the same view, so the other two elf groups are on a time limit before the trees start speaking Eltharin with malicious intent. In terms of actual stuff, the Wood Elves would also probably keep going on as they did. Live in Athel Loren, keep others out, violently purge Beastmen whenever they show up. Simple stuff. They're probably going to be pretty badly off for a while due to the death of Kurnos and Orion, and Ariel getting schlorped into Alariel, but nature is resilient. They'll find a way to adapt. The High Elves and Dark Elves, though, oh dear lord. Finding a home isn't even necessarily the first hurdle they're gonna have to get over, but we'll talk about that one first. Naggaroth isn't a horrible idea, at least as far as just living somewhere goes. Not the nicest place in the world, but maybe if enough High Elves go with, they can use some life magic to actually grow food. But there's plenty of former elven colonies around the world to consider. Sure, those are located in places like Bretonnia, Estalia, Talaya, places currently occupied, but Malekith isn't exactly a nice person. If anything, the fact there's already plenty of humans in those locations means they don't need to worry about slaves when they get there, so in the immediate future, the new homeland of the Elves might be permanently borrowed from mankind. Speaking of Malekith not being a nice person though, the Elven Civil War finishing up nicely paves the war for the Elven Civil War Round 2. The differing factions of Elves stuck together in the end times because this was it. There's no time to settle their problems in a better way because the world is falling apart. Now that the situation has been stabilized, there's going to be so many different people shouting for different things that there might not even be just High and Dark Elves anymore. There will be those loyal to Malekith, seeing him as the rightful new Phoenix King. On the other hand, Tyrion is probably not going to be happy with this, and I imagine quite a few others might go with him. Now you might say, oh, but that's just the High and Dark Elves again, but we have to look at the end times for why that isn't the case. Regardless of the fact Malekith being the only true Phoenix King was retconned in AOS, and for the better might I add, he was Assyrian's avatar during the end times. He held the position and the Elven King of the Gods threw his power behind him, which is the sort of thing that gives a ruler a lot of legitimacy. Tyrion, meanwhile, became the avatar of Cain. He was a noble hero beforehand and became the embodiment of the head of the Dark Elf pantheon, which is naturally going to attract a lot of people from both sides towards him. And for the laundry list of reasons they hate each other, they're not going to be getting along after everything is settled. And of course, this is to say nothing of the elves who want to return to the old days of High Elves versus Dark Elves, but can't under any of the old leaders, because Tyrion and Malekith both have mixed courts now. Breakaway factions of these groups might spring up, either forming together with anyone like-minded or based on old loyalties, such as where they came from Ulthuan. All of these groups are going to share that vested interest in finding new places to live, and depending on their mindsets and where they choose, they may either live peacefully with others, shack up with humans, or go on wars against the occupants of wherever they end up. Even against elves that were once on the same side as them, they might fight over resources and limited territory. Ulthuan and Naggaroth, regardless of if they're settled, will likely be frequently raided by all these differing groups. Ulthuan would have countless artifacts that sank with it, and Naggaroth will probably have some stuff left that the Druchii couldn't take with them. New leaders might arise during this time out of any spoils or promises of a homeland that they can follow through on. The ultimate winner of this god knows how many ways Second Elf Civil War might in the end be whoever Alariel decides to stick with. Aside from being the Everqueen, she's more or less Isha now. In fact, in terms of power and who she is, she's pretty much Age of Sigmar Alariel, just still in fantasy. Because of that, she might also have a decent chunk of Wood Elf supporters behind her as well, on top of everyone else. With all she has going for her, whoever she supports would have a clear advantage, assuming she doesn't go off on her own. She might go with Tyrion out of love for him and a disdain for having to share rulership with Malekith. That being said, in order to provide some measure of stability for her people, she might continue being the Everqueen to his Phoenix King. That would be the most loveless, sexist marriage between two people who absolutely hate each other, but for the sake of the elves, she might do it. And if she does choose to go off on her own, she'd be one more faction to add to the pile of them going at each other. At the end of the day, the elves are becoming sort of an inverse of the dwarfs. They're likely not going to be as psychologically ruined, but in terms of material losses, they're arguably worse off. The dwarfs can always retake the Everpeak or build a new capital. You can't unsync Ulthuan or unfuse Isha, Alariel, and Ariel. Perhaps this isn't the most detailed of summaries as to what they'd likely be up to, but the elves as a whole would likely be trying to sort this shit out for some time. Probably the only one both not involved in all this crap and alive would be Teclis. The poor dude would probably just be trying to apologize to Tyrion for getting his daughter killed and attempting to stabilize the world in general after chaos wrecked shop. Speaking of, someone's gonna have to come up with a replacement vortex fast. It wasn't just a pretty light show, it kept magic drained from the world so demons couldn't manifest out of nothing. Either there's gonna be a whole lot of new waystones that drain magic without the vortex's help, or there's gonna need to be a second one. Teclis is the best guy for the job on that one, so he can have fun with that. Poor Teclis. Even when your plan to save the world succeeds, you just can't get a win. Maybe he'd go find Gotrek and Felix and whatever they're doing and just become a permanent member of the group. He does know them, they adventured together, who's to say he can't do it on a permanent basis? Next up are the alternate Lizardmen. The Great Plan didn't fail, but it certainly has some hiccups. Chiefly among them the fact that much like Ulthuan, Lustria is gone. The landmass technically still exists, but unlike the smaller human kingdoms, this instance of Skaven corruption is going to be a lot harder to deal with. You know, because they crashed the goddamn moon into it. Whatever the rest of the world actually physically looks like at this point in time, Lustria looks like the Covenant paid it a visit. Countless plaques and ancient relics of the old ones are gone, and if there's more than half a dozen spawning pools left in the entire continent, I would be amazed. There's even fewer remaining Slann left now, most of them from the weaker generations, and Mazdamundi is dead. Much like Carter, that fat bastard sure had the mass. For that matter, Gorok and Nakai are also dead, because if memory serves, their death in the end times came about by way of the moon crashing on top of them. The Southlands were also pretty badly damaged by the Warpstone meteor impacts, so they're probably also out in terms of living in. The Lizardmen do have some things up their sleeves, though. Lord Croak fully returned, having decided death is simply no longer an option. It wasn't much of a handicap to begin with for him, but now it's even less of one. Certain other characters like Krotgar and Oxyotl also likely survived. Krotgar, to my knowledge, was never actually killed in the end times and likely made it to their spaceships, and Oxyotl was already Lizardman Kaldor Drago. If he can survive in the realm of chaos for thousands of years, he can survive the failed end of the world. Wherever the remains of the Lizardmen end up, they'll likely terraform it to resemble old Lustria. Depending on circumstances, such as resistance they face and the type of any artifacts or Slann remaining, much of them may end up recolonizing Lustria and the Southlands. The Warpstone blanketing the region is going to make that very difficult, but the alternatives are using their vastly reduced forces to fight others for territory. Lord Croak would easily be able to clear it up, I imagine, though. He's Lord Croak. I don't have to explain how or why he could do it. Lord Frog is simply built different. And the Slann did use magical shields bolstered by their temple ships to keep everyone safe. In this timeline, perhaps those cities do still rise, but instead of fucking off into outer space, they stay on the planet to repopulate. Beyond that, the Lizardmen might become closer to their Age of Sigmar incarnation than as they were in fantasy. Probably not with the lightning blood, and obviously there's still going to be giant angry Aztec lizards riding dinosaurs. You can't improve upon perfection in that regard, but they might become more willing to work with the other forces of order. After all, sticking to the Great Plan in total isolation resulted in their homeland being moonfalled and almost all of the remaining leaders being killed. Them turning into Age of Sigmar Lizardmen seems like a natural progression. Some of them in AOS even still believe the Great Plan factored in the end times, so it's not like we have to abandon that here either. The issue is, of course, getting to that point. The Lizardmen in Age of Sigmar reached the point where they could create their own spawning pools only after countless years of floating through space meditating between worlds. They don't have that time here. What they do have is a whole lot of problems that, unlike in the Age of Sigmar timeline, are actively beating down their door. Any aspiring Chaos Warriors looking to ascend in Archaon's wake would surely be granted demonhood if they finished off the Old One's servants, and Lustria now being 50% warpstone by surface area is going to attract the entire goddamned Under Empire to whatever is left of it. Much like the Elves, they need to find a new home, and then after that they need to immediately get on figuring out how to create new spawning pools. If they can solve these issues, then the Lizardmen will be well on their way to not just recovery, but potentially being even stronger than they were before, and more willing to work with Wormbloods. If they can't solve them in time, then they'll slowly but surely be driven into extinction. The last remaining Lizardman might be Lord Croak, refusing to truly die with the rest of his kin well into the future of the world. Almost done now, and our second to last group is one that also isn't changing very much. The Skaven. Much like I said with the Orcs, I cannot think of any conceivable way the Skaven are changing in a significant manner. When they win and keep being the worst. If they lose, they take it as a sign that that particular leader was just incompetent, kill him, and then immediately resume doing the same shit. The worst case scenario is that they'll be vastly diminished and go through a period of recuperating, much like the Dwarfs, only far quicker. Most likely scenario, all the leaders that are still alive are going to immediately start jockeying for positions of power, and another Skaven civil war is going to break out. All the while, Thanquol pulls off some absolutely phenomenal levels of bullshit to remain in power. Because the Great Horned Rat not only favors him, but finds him funny. You're not getting rid of him. For real though, in the Age of Sigmar timeline, they dug so deep they crashed the Realm of Chaos. They were granted infinity, and then they ran out of space. It's how they teleport. All the Skaven clans from fantasy are the same in Age of Sigmar, they're just types of clans now. The only thing that'll really change is the name of the guy sending hordes of clan rats to their doom. Speaking of, the biggest change is probably going to be who's on the Council of 13. The Great Horned Rat sort of ate the entire previous one during the end times and then said Thanquol was in charge. With the world still going, I'm sure the Council of 13 will become a showcase of all the remaining Skaven legendary lords from Total War, as well as some new folk. Queek got choked out by Thorgrim, but Snick Shanikit are probably going to be on it. And Thanquol's still here. I've tried to be good with every faction and not just plot armor the characters I like through the thing, but no, not Thanquol. I'm pulling a "this is my video, I can do what I want" stunt here. Best Rat survives to lead the Skaven to countless casualties another day. Things stay the same, though. The biggest change they have isn't even going to be in Skaven society. Good luck to the Empire of Man hiding the existence of Ratmen after millions of them come pouring out of the ground. And finally, we come to the Undead. There's a reason I saved this one for last. It's because I spent the entirety of writing this video trying to come up with a way that involves Nagash existing on the Warhammer world as he was in the end times, without just killing everyone. Because Nagash, you see, is sort of powerful. In fact, I would wager that he's the single strongest being alive in the mortal world. Yes, including Lord Croak and Alariel. The only possible way I can see the world continuing onwards without him just eating it after chaos is dealt with is if he's once again mortally wounded as he has been before. Or maybe Ikit just nukes him again. If it ain't broke, don't fix it after all, and it clearly ain't broke because it worked again in Age of Sigmar. Problem is though that in this post-end times world, he basically serves the same role he does in Age of Sigmar. He consumed more, he's now the god of the dead proper. When you die, it's into his clutches you go. He became death magic incarnate and also ate Valaya just for good measure. He also asserted his will over pretty much every non-Tomb King undead with magic, and did it to the Tomb Kings with the more traditional method of threatening to destroy them if they didn't comply. This could be another way he's somewhat indisposed of in the mortal world. Perhaps him being the god of the dead now means he has more responsibilities, or at the very least he has to watch over the afterlife if only so he can gain power from it. But either way, dude's properly jacked now. Quite frankly, the undead are the new powerhouses in this world. Even if Nagash is essentially confined to the underworld for all but a few moments at a time as I'm making him, his rulership over the undead is near absolute. He can enforce his will upon pretty much all of them, and they'll do his bidding no matter what. And for everyone else, in terms of pure power, him throwing a hissy fit annihilated an entire army of Beastmen, Nurgle demons, and Skaven. During the final battle, he also choked out a bloodthirster because it made the mistake of being within arm's reach, and I'm almost positive it was Kabanda. Incidentally, if it was, suck it, Sanguinius. One of the only exceptions of this I can think of, and someone who might become a savior of the living funnily enough because of it, is Settra. Nagash and Settra fought after Nagash ascended to godhood, and in spite of that, in their combat of wills, they were equal. It took Nagash swarming him with spirits until Settra couldn't move so he could grab him, and even then Settra just delivered the most badass line ever and kept resisting. Given he returned after the fact, Settra might rally whatever Tomb King dissenters he can find and bring them to his cause. Even if they say no, he's depriving Nagash of forces either way, because anyone who says no is getting turned into catapult ammo. For the Tomb Kings, that'll unfortunately be the extent of their role for some time. A war of the dead for control of Nehekra until Nagash either wins or can be dealt with in one way or another. I also regret to inform you that the Vampire Coast is basically gone. Their unfortunate appearance in the end times was most prominently them all getting wiped out. Say it together with me now, everyone. Manfred von Karstein is the absolute worst. Speaking of, though, the undead such as vampires will also likely take on a similar role to that they have in Age of Sigmar, when Nagash is the head of all of them and most people below him serving, even if they try and break free of his chains. Perhaps another standout would be Vlad. He's an elector now, after all. In fact, that might be a great way to keep the peace between him and the Empire's humans, with him serving as someone who both has knowledge on Nagash as well as someone who's more than happy to fight him. Bringing back Isabella was the only reason he stuck with Nagash during the end times as long as he did. In this timeline, he either used the von Karstein ring to free her of Nurglite possession, or she's dead and Nagash has no hold on him anymore. Manfred also might do what he did prior to his vampire war and roam the world looking for magical artifacts, but Nagash would probably be keeping a close eye on him. He'd watch all the vampires, but it never hurts to be extra cautious with this dickhead. Ultimately though, and while you may think it's dismissive of both the undead as a whole and everyone else, I genuinely think that in a world where the end times didn't succeed, Nagash's reign over the undead would be near absolute. The plots of every necromancer, vampire, and tomb king would be forced to either serve Nagash or subvert him, because just ignoring him is like ignoring a train when you're stuck on the track. With chaos dealt with, the world will have to contend with the fact that Nagash has returned stronger than ever before. The other divine or close enough powers that remain, such as Alariel and Croak, will likely be more than anything preoccupied with ensuring Nagash doesn't once again try to subsume all life in the world into his rule. With the world as ravaged as it is, with countless bodies still littering battlefield after battlefield, the great necromancer will be ascendant. He might not have succeeded at becoming chaos this time, but he's if nothing else patient. In fact, I need you to understand that while the undead section may be relatively short given all that I'm lumping together in it, this is because Nagash's rule is almost uncontested. More than any other faction or character, it is him and his forces that will be on the mind of every single being in this setting going forward. While in canon he's admittedly losing more often than he's winning, that's because the stakes of what he does in the narrative is all or nothing. It's either he loses or everyone else loses. Nagash coming back and staying in Warhammer Fantasy after the end times is completely rewriting the rules of the setting. When he was dead, characters in the know of him lived in fear of anything even remotely associated with him. Another minor Gotchick and Felix spoiler, but this is within the first 20 pages of the book it's in or so not too much of a deal. When one of his artifacts shows up in one of their books, the character Max has a panic attack before almost immediately fainting when he realizes what he's holding. He scares the Chaos Gods because he has the potential to not just fight them, but unmake them entirely. In Age of Sigmar, he alone is enough to create an entire grand alliance who's capable of fighting the forces of order, destruction, and chaos on relatively equal footing. And in this alternate Warhammer timeline, we have a Nagash approaching what he is in Age of Sigmar without any true equivalents to stand up to him. If there's any peace between the factions either because of or in spite of the reasons I mentioned for each of them earlier, it's partially because everyone is hesitant to start any more massive conflicts, because every death they cause is another soul given to Nagash. Such is the power of the Great Necromancer. And that's a very brief alternate history for the end times of Warhammer Fantasy. Brief for each faction, at least. This was a long one. This was a lot of fun to write and make. I got to try and think of my own stuff for once, which is always fun. If you like this, do let me know if you want to see more of this kind of stuff. I've already got some ideas for looking at individual factions in this timeline more in depth. Since this is such a broad video, I feel like more topics could be made about it without feeling like I'm milking the idea to death. Thank you to my wonderful channel members. You are the natural light to my writing process, keeping me going while I'm at it. This isn't another sponsor, I'm just drinking a natural light while I'm recording this. It isn't terribly good. I prefer Miller. Or vodka. Fireball and Coke is also a banger if you haven't tried it. It's like Dr. Pepper that gets you smashed. If you'd like to support the channel, feel free to subscribe or become a member. Either way, thank you for watching and take care out there. I can't believe I forgot the most important faction, the Halflings. 50-50 on if they're completely unchanged because no one would bother to attack them, or Vlad has turned the region into a Capri Sun factory.